Naomi Brooks sat perfectly still at the defense table, her hands folded in her lap, while the family that raised her stared at her like she was a stranger who had broken into their house and stolen something that was never hers to take. The courtroom in downtown Atlanta was cold, the kind of cold that came from old marble floors and older grudges. Robert Whitmore sat 2 rows behind the plaintiff's table in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the daughter he had never once called his own in front of his country club friends. Beside him, Elaine Whitmore dabbed at dry eyes with a folded handkerchief, performing grief for a mother-in-law she had resented for 30 years. Preston Whitmore, the older brother, checked his watch as if the lawsuit were an inconvenient meeting between golf and dinner. Caroline Whitmore, the sister, sat with her legs crossed and her chin lifted, already rehearsing the sympathetic expression she would wear if a reporter happened to be outside. They had sued her for $2.3 million, not because they needed the money. Robert Whitmore's company alone was worth 30 times that. They had sued her because Margaret Whitmore, the grandmother who had rocked Naomi to sleep as a child when no one else in that house would touch her, had left the entire trust to Naomi and nearly nothing to the family that shared her blood. And a black woman inheriting that kind of money from a white family matriarch was in their eyes not an act of love, it was theft. It had to be theft. Because if it wasn't theft, then it meant Margaret Whitmore had looked at her family for 81 years and decided in the end that the outsider understood her better than her own children ever had. Naomi did not flinch when the judge entered. She did not flinch when the family's attorney rose with a leather folder thick enough to intimidate a jury that did not exist. Because this was a bench trial, judge only, no jury to sway with theatrics. She simply breathed, the way she had trained herself to breathe since she was 7 years old, and learned that showing emotion in that house only gave people more reasons to hurt her. To understand how Naomi Brooks ended up sitting across a courtroom from the only family she had ever known, it helps to go back to the beginning, back before the money, back before the funeral, back to a little girl standing in the doorway of a mansion in Buckhead, holding a small paper bag that contained everything she owned. She was 6 years old when the Whitmores adopted her. The paperwork said her birth mother, a woman named Denise Carter, had passed away from complications after a long illness, and that no father was listed. The Whitmores told everyone at their church and their charity galas that they had opened their home to a child in need, that they believed in giving back, that love had no color. They said this while dressed in their finest clothes, holding champagne glasses, smiling for photographs that would run in the society pages. Behind closed doors, love very much had a color, and it was not the color of the 6-year-old girl sleeping in the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall. Elaine Whitmore never called her daughter. She called her the girl when she thought no one important was listening, and our Naomi when cameras were present. Robert Whitmore rarely spoke to her at all, treating her presence in his home the way a man might treat a tax he resented, but tolerated because his mother insisted on it. Preston, 5 years older, made it his personal mission to remind Naomi that she did not belong, hiding her school supplies, telling his friends she was the charity case, laughing when she cried. Caroline, 3 years older, was more subtle in her cruelty, the kind of cruelty that came wrapped in compliments. She would tell Naomi her hair was so interesting in front of guests, then leave her out of every sleepover, every family photo unless the photographer insisted, every birthday party guest list until she was old enough to notice the pattern and stop expecting invitations at all. Only one person in that house ever looked at Naomi and saw a granddaughter instead of an obligation. Margaret Whitmore, Robert's mother, had moved into the guest wing of the estate 2 years before Naomi arrived, after her husband passed and the big house in Savannah became too quiet to bear alone. She was sharp-tongued, unimpressed by wealth despite having plenty of it, and utterly uninterested in the family's obsession with appearances. The first week Naomi arrived, frightened and silent, it was Margaret who found her sitting alone on the back staircase at midnight, unable to sleep in an unfamiliar house full of unfamiliar people. Margaret did not ask her why she was crying. She simply sat down next to her on the cold marble step in her nightgown, at 81 years younger than she would eventually become, and said, "You don't have to explain yourself to me, child. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to keep you company." From that night forward, Margaret became the only steady thing in Naomi's world. It was Margaret who taught her to read a balance sheet at age 10, sitting at the kitchen table long after the rest of the family had gone to bed, explaining how numbers never lied even when people did. It was Margaret who taught her chess patiently over hundreds of quiet evenings, telling her that the smartest piece on the board was never the queen who charged forward loudly, but the one who watched everything and moved only when the moment was right. It was Margaret who noticed when Naomi came home from school with her confidence chipped away by another cruel comment from Caroline, and who would simply say, "They see a shadow when they look at you. One day the whole world is going to see the sun." It was Margaret, and only Margaret, who showed up to Naomi's college graduation from Georgia Tech, sitting alone in the family section because Robert had a business trip he refused to reschedule, Elaine had a charity gala, and Preston and Caroline simply didn't come. Naomi built her adult life quietly, the way Margaret had taught her to build anything worth having. She became a cybersecurity analyst, then a financial fraud investigator, spending her days tracing hidden money trails for a firm that worked with banks and insurance companies to expose embezzlement, shell companies, and elder financial abuse. She was good at her job because she understood something most investigators didn't fully grasp until years into their careers. People who steal rarely believe they are stealing. They believe they are owed. She had grown up watching that exact belief operate in real time, in her own house, disguised as entitlement. She kept a modest apartment in Atlanta, drove a car that was 10 years old but always maintained, and visited Margaret every single Sunday without fail, rain or shine, promotion or setback for over a decade. The rest of the family visited Margaret on holidays, when cameras and inheritance expectations required their presence. Naomi visited because she loved her. Margaret Whitmore died on a quiet Tuesday morning in March in her sleep at her home, with a home hospice nurse nearby and a half-finished crossword puzzle on her nightstand. She was 89 years old. Naomi received the call from the hospice nurse before anyone else in the family, because Margaret had listed her, not Robert, not Elaine, as her primary emergency contact for the past 4 years. That detail alone should have told the family everything they needed to know about where they stood in Margaret's heart. Instead, it only made them angrier when the will was read 3 weeks later. The reading took place in a law office on Peachtree Street, in a room with a long mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city Margaret had loved. Robert sat at the head of the table like he already owned it. Elaine sat beside him, already dressed in black even though the funeral had been the week before. Preston and Caroline sat across from Naomi, exchanging glances that said they expected this to be a formality, a confirmation of what they already assumed was coming to them. The attorney, an older man named Franklin Reyes who had handled Margaret's affairs for over 20 years, opened the folder and began to read. The family estate in Savannah, held in a separate trust, would be divided among Robert, Preston, and Caroline as previously arranged. Margaret's personal jewelry would go to Caroline and Elaine. A modest collection of stocks would be split among the grandchildren, Preston and Caroline receiving their shares outright. Then Franklin Reyes paused, adjusted his glasses, and continued reading. To my granddaughter, Naomi Brooks, I leave the Whitmore Legacy Trust, valued at $2,300,000 to be distributed to her in full, without condition, effective immediately upon my passing. The silence in that room lasted only 4 seconds before it exploded. Robert stood up so fast his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. That's not possible, he said. That trust was meant for the family. She is family, Mr. Whitmore, Franklin Reyes said calmly, according to your mother's wishes, clearly documented and legally binding. Elaine's voice cracked with something that sounded like grief but was, in truth, pure fury. She manipulated an old woman. That girl has been visiting Margaret every week for years, filling her head with God knows what, isolating her from her real family. Naomi did not raise her voice. She never did, she simply said, I visited her because I loved her, that's all it ever was. Caroline scoffed. Convenient that love comes with a $2.3 million price tag. Preston, already reaching for his phone, said what the rest of them were thinking but hadn't yet said aloud. We're contesting this, today. 6 weeks later, Naomi received a certified letter informing her that Robert, Elaine, Preston, and Caroline Whitmore had filed a joint petition in probate court to invalidate the trust, alleging undue influence, elder manipulation, and intentional isolation of a vulnerable elderly individual. They were suing her, formally and publicly, for the full $2.3 million, plus legal fees, plus damages for what their filing called emotional distress caused by the defendant's calculated exploitation of a diminished elderly woman. Naomi read the filing twice at her kitchen table, alone, the way she had read every difficult document in her life. She did not cry, she did not call a friend to vent. She made a pot of coffee, opened her laptop, and began doing what she had always done when the world tried to convince her she was small. She started preparing. The first thing Naomi did was hire an attorney, and she did not choose the biggest name in Atlanta. She chose a woman named Priya Malhotra, who ran a small practice out of a converted brownstone near Little 5 Points, specializing in elder law and probate litigation. Priya had a reputation among people who actually paid attention, rather than people who only cared about billboard advertisements, for being relentless, thorough, and quietly devastating in cross-examination. She did not do theatrics, she did homework. In their first meeting, Priya listened to Naomi's entire history without interrupting once, taking notes in a plain composition notebook instead of a laptop. When Naomi finished, Priya set down her pen and said, "They're accusing you of isolating Margaret and manipulating her finances. That's a specific claim. Specific claims require specific evidence, which means they'll have to show a paper trail. Families that make an accusation like this usually do it because it's the only way to distract from a paper trail of their own." She looked directly at Naomi. "Do you think there's a chance that's what's happening here?" Naomi thought about the years of Margaret mentioning, almost in passing, unusual withdrawals from her accounts. She thought about a caregiver invoice Margaret had once shown her, confused because the hours billed didn't match the hours the caregiver had actually been in the house. She thought about Preston's business, which had quietly struggled for the past 3 years despite his public image of success. She thought about Caroline's sudden home renovation and Robert's new boat, purchases that never seemed to match his company's actual performance according to public filings. Naomi had glanced at out of professional habit. "I think," Naomi said quietly, "that you should ask for full financial discovery. All of it. Every account Margaret had, every check, every withdrawal going back 6 years. Priya smiled for the first time that day. "That's exactly what I was thinking. You investigate fraud for a living. I have a feeling you already know where to look." The discovery process took 4 months, and it unfolded like a slow excavation, each layer revealing something worse than the last. Bank records showed that Margaret's primary checking account had issued 11 checks over 3 years to a caregiving agency for services that, according to the agency's own scheduling logs subpoenaed by Priya, had never actually been provided. The checks totaled over $140,000. Every single one had been signed by Margaret's hand, but every single one had been requested, filled out, and mailed by Elaine Whitmore, who held power of attorney over Margaret's day-to-day bill payments during a period when Margaret's arthritis made writing difficult. Then came Preston. Bank records showed 4 separate wire transfers from Margaret's investment account to Preston's struggling business, totaling $320,000 over 2 years, each one labeled internally as a loan, none of which had ever been repaid. None of which had ever been formally documented with interest terms or repayment schedules, despite Preston's sworn deposition testimony, claiming the transfers were informal gifts freely given out of family generosity. Then came Caroline. Credit card statements linked to an account Margaret had co-signed for emergency purposes only showed over $60,000 in charges for home renovations, designer furniture, and a family vacation to the Amalfi Coast that Caroline had posted about extensively on social media without ever mentioning that her elderly grandmother's credit had funded it. And then came the medical records, the ones that would matter most in the end. Margaret's physician, Dr. Adiz Akafer, had documented in her clinical notes, months before her death, a conversation in which Margaret expressed frustration that her son and grandchildren rarely visited unless she brought up money, and gratitude that "my Naomi still comes every Sunday like clockwork, asking for nothing." The same records showed that Margaret's cognition had been tested twice in her final 2 years, and both times scored in the normal range for her age, directly contradicting the family's core legal argument that she had been mentally vulnerable and easily manipulated. Naomi read every document Priya's team compiled with the same clinical detachment she brought to her professional fraud cases. Except this time her hands trembled slightly each time she confirmed what she had long suspected but never had proof of. The people who accused her of exploiting Margaret had been quietly draining her for years, using her love and her generosity as a private interest-free bank, and then panicking when the woman they had been stealing from decided in her final act to give everything of real value to the one person who had never asked her for a single dollar. The trial began on a humid morning in late September in a courtroom presided over by Judge Alina Marsh, a woman known throughout the Fulton County legal community for her sharp memory, her low tolerance for theatrics, and her habit of asking one devastating question right when a witness thought they had survived cross-examination. The Whitmore family's attorney, a tall, silver-haired man named Douglas Kane, who had built his career representing wealthy families in exactly these kinds of disputes, rose for his opening statement with the practiced confidence of a man who had never lost in this courtroom before. He spoke of Margaret Whitmore as a beloved matriarch, gentle and trusting in her final years, and of Naomi Brooks as a calculated outsider who had inserted herself into the family decades ago, and spent years quietly positioning herself to inherit a fortune that rightfully belonged to Margaret's actual bloodline. He used the word outsider 4 times in 11 minutes. He used the phrase manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman, as though he were reading a headline he had already written before ever meeting his own client's mother. Priya Malhotra rose for the defense's opening statement and spoke for less than 90 seconds. "The plaintiffs are going to tell you a story about manipulation," she said, standing calmly with no notes in her hands. "We are going to show you the actual bank statements. We are going to let the numbers speak, because unlike memories, unlike feelings, unlike 30 years of family resentment, numbers do not lie. When this trial is over, Your Honor will understand exactly who spent years taking from Margaret Whitmore and exactly who spent years simply loving her." She sat back down. Naomi noticed Judge Marsh's eyebrow lift just slightly, the first crack in her carefully neutral expression. Elaine Whitmore testified first, dressed in soft gray, her voice trembling with what looked to anyone who didn't know better like genuine grief. She described Margaret as increasingly withdrawn in her final years, claiming Naomi had discouraged Margaret from attending family gatherings and had poisoned her against the people who loved her most. Douglas Kane guided her gently through the narrative, and for a moment, watching Elaine dab at her eyes, it was almost convincing. Then Priya rose for cross-examination. Mrs. Whitmore, you testified that you held power of attorney over your mother-in-law's routine bill payments beginning 4 years ago, is that correct? Yes. And during that period, you were responsible for issuing checks to a home caregiving agency called Sunrise Family Care, correct? That's correct. For Margaret's in-home assistance, Priya walked to the evidence table and picked up a folder. I'd like to show the witness what's been marked as Exhibit 14. She handed the document to Elaine. Can you confirm these are the scheduling logs from Sunrise Family Care for the dates corresponding to the 11 checks you issued from Margaret's account? Elaine glanced at the document, her composure flickering for the first time. I'm not familiar with their internal scheduling. Let the record reflect, Priya said, turning toward the judge, that Sunrise Family Care has no record of providing services on 9 of the 11 dates corresponding to checks totaling over $140,000, checks that Mrs. Whitmore has already confirmed under oath that she personally requested and mailed. Judge Marsh looked up from her notes for the first time since the testimony began. Mrs. Whitmore, Priya continued, her voice level unhurried, can you explain where that money went if it wasn't paid to the caregiving agency for actual services rendered? Elaine's mouth opened, then closed. I would need to review my records, she finally said. No further questions, Priya said, and returned to her seat. Preston testified next, his tone shifting from his sister's practiced sorrow to something closer to indignation, as if the very idea of being questioned about his grandmother's money was beneath him. He described the wire transfers from Margaret's investment account as generous gifts a grandmother chose to give her grandson, insisting there had never been any expectation of repayment. Priya approached with a single sheet of paper. Mr. Whitmore, I'd like to direct your attention to an email you sent to Margaret Whitmore 18 months ago, obtained through Discovery. In it, you wrote, and I quote, I promise this is the last time I'll need to borrow from you, Grandma. I'll pay back the $200,000 from the last transfer plus this one as soon as the Q3 numbers come in. Do you recognize this email, Mr. Whitmore? Preston's jaw tightened. I may have said that, it was just a figure of speech. A figure of speech, Priya repeated slowly, letting the words sit in the silent courtroom. You referred to the money as something you needed to borrow and promised to pay back, in writing, to the very woman your attorney has described as too vulnerable to understand financial matters. Which is it, Mr. Whitmore? Was your grandmother sharp enough to understand a loan agreement, or was she too vulnerable to understand anything at all? Because your own words can't support both arguments at once. Preston had no answer. Judge Marsh wrote something down and did not look up again for several seconds. Caroline's testimony fared no better. She insisted the $60,000 in charges on Margaret's co-signed emergency credit card were for unexpected medical and household needs. Until Priya produced the actual itemized statement showing a designer furniture purchase, a spa package, and a $9,000 charge from a resort in Positano, dated during the same week Caroline's own social media account had posted photographs captioned "grateful for this once-in-a-lifetime trip." Caroline's polished composure cracked into something colder, angrier, and far less camera-ready. Robert Whitmore testified last, and his approach was different from his children's. He did not deny the withdrawals directly. Instead, he leaned on outrage, on wounded pride, on the family name. He spoke about how the Whitmore family had given Naomi a life she never would have had otherwise. How they had clothed her, educated her, raised her as their own despite what he called the challenges of bringing an outside child into an established family. He said the word grateful as though Naomi owed a debt that could never be repaid, certainly not by allowing her to walk away with money that should have stayed inside the bloodline. Priya let him finish. Then she asked a single quiet question. Mr. Whitmore, in the 30 years since Naomi joined your family, can you tell the court a single memory, just one, of a moment where you personally showed her affection the way a father shows his daughter? The courtroom went still. Robert opened his mouth, and for the first time since the trial began, no words came out. The silence stretched 5 seconds, then 10. Judge Marsh watched him with an expression that had shifted from professional neutrality into something closer to quiet disappointment. I provided for her, Robert finally said. Financially, that's what a father does. That wasn't the question, Priya said gently and sat down. By the time the plaintiffs rested their case, the courtroom's entire atmosphere had shifted. What had begun as a lawsuit accusing Naomi Brooks of preying on a vulnerable old woman had transformed, witness by witness, into a slow and undeniable exposure of a family that had spent years quietly siphoning money from that same woman, while accusing the one person who never took a dollar of being the thief. When it came time for the defense to present its case, Priya called only one witness before Naomi herself. Dr. Adiz Akafer, Margaret's longtime physician, who testified under oath that Margaret's cognitive assessments had shown no signs of impairment in the final 2 years of her life, and read aloud, with the court's permission, the clinical note in which Margaret had specifically praised Naomi's consistency and expressed sadness about her biological family's absence. Then Priya called Naomi Brooks to the stand. Naomi walked to the witness box the way she walked into every difficult room in her life, spine straight, expression calm, hands steady. She answered every question plainly, without embellishment, without performing grief or performing strength. She described Sunday visits that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with chess games and crossword puzzles, and a woman who had once told a frightened 6-year-old that she didn't have to explain herself. Douglas Kane rose for cross-examination, sensing his last opportunity to salvage the family's case, and he did what desperate attorneys sometimes do when the evidence has turned against them. He aimed for something personal. "Brooks," he said, his voice sharpening, "isn't it true that you were never really part of this family, that despite 30 years under the Whitmore roof, you always remained fundamentally an outsider looking in? It was meant to wound her. It was meant to remind the courtroom." One last time of the racial fault line, the family had never openly named, but had always quietly relied on the assumption that a black woman raised in a white family could never truly belong to it. That her inheritance was inherently suspicious precisely because she looked like she didn't fit. Judge Marsh's eyes moved to Naomi, waiting. Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the question sit in the room the way Margaret had taught her patients always allowed the truth room to breathe. Then she turned toward Priya, who gave the smallest nod, and Naomi reached into the folder resting beside her on the witness stand. One Priya had kept sealed and unmentioned until this exact moment, prepared for weeks for whatever opening the family's own attorney might give them. Judge Marsh, sensing something significant was about to happen, leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Brooks, do you have a response to counsel's question?" Naomi stood, calm as still water, and looked directly at the family that had spent 30 years insisting she did not belong to them. "DNA match," she said. The words landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into a silent lake. Douglas Kane's confident posture faltered. Robert Whitmore's face, already pale from the morning's testimony, drained further, the color leaving him so visibly that even Judge Marsh's composed expression shifted into something close to alarm. "Your Honor," Priya said, rising, "the defense would like to submit Exhibit 41, a certified DNA analysis report, along with a sealed letter written by Margaret Whitmore approximately 4 months before her passing, both of which were provided to us during a supplemental discovery request 3 weeks ago." Douglas Kane objected, scrambling, insisting the evidence was untimely. But Judge Marsh, her voice quieter and more careful than it had been all trial, overruled him. "Given the nature of what's being alleged in this courtroom, Mr. Kane, I think we all need to hear this." Priya explained methodically what the report showed. Years earlier, before Naomi was ever adopted, Robert's younger brother, Charles Whitmore, had a private and long-hidden relationship with a woman named Denise Carter, Naomi's biological mother, during a period when Charles was estranged from the family and living quietly outside Savannah. Charles died in an accident before Naomi was born, and Denise, facing illness and financial hardship years later, placed her daughter for adoption without revealing the identity of the father, fearing what a wealthy white family might do with that information if it ever surfaced. The Whitmores, who processed Naomi's adoption years later through a private arrangement, rather than a public agency, never made the connection, or perhaps, as later documents would suggest, they did make the connection and chose to bury it, rather than acknowledge a black grandchild with legitimate blood ties to their family. Margaret, going through Charles's old belongings after a storage unit was finally cleared out following years of putting it off, discovered a stack of letters between Charles and Denise, along with a photograph of Denise pregnant, dated months before Naomi's birth. Margaret quietly commissioned a private DNA test, using a sample from Naomi's childhood hairbrush that Margaret had kept, sentimentally, since Naomi was a girl, and compared it against remaining Whitmore family DNA records from an unrelated medical matter years prior. The results confirmed a biological match consistent with a grandmother and granddaughter relationship through the paternal line. Margaret had known, for the final year of her life, that Naomi was not simply the outsider the family treated her as. She was blood. She had always been blood. And the family that spent 30 years making her feel like a guest in their home had been, all along, denying her a truth that legally and biologically belonged to her. Priya handed the sealed letter to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Marsh. The judge read it silently first, her expression tightening with each line before she looked up and addressed the courtroom. "I'm going to read a portion of this letter into the record," she said, "written by Margaret Whitmore, dated 5 months before her death." She adjusted her glasses and began to read aloud, her voice steady but noticeably softer than the tone she had used throughout the trial. "To whoever reads this after I am gone. I want it understood clearly that Naomi Brooks is not, and was never, an outsider in this family. She is my granddaughter through my son Charles, whose relationship with her mother this family chose to erase rather than honor, because they could not accept what that truth meant about the people they claimed to be. I discovered this only in my final year, and I have spent every day since wishing I had known sooner, wishing I could have given her 30 years of being loved as what she always was, instead of 30 years of being tolerated as what they decided she must be. This trust is not charity, it is not generosity. It is simply finally giving my granddaughter what should have been hers from the beginning. If my family contests this after I am gone, let this letter stand as my answer to them. Naomi was never the outsider you were. The courtroom was silent for what felt like a full minute. Elaine Whitmore had her hand pressed over her mouth. Caroline stared at the floor. Preston's expensive composure had entirely collapsed. Robert Whitmore sat motionless, the man who had spent decades insisting he had given a stranger's child everything. Now confronted with the fact that the child he refused to fully claim had been biologically and undeniably his own brother's daughter, his mother's true grandchild, family, in every sense the law and blood could define all along. Judge Marsh set the letter down and looked directly at the plaintiff's table. This court has heard extensive testimony over the past several days, she said, regarding claims that Naomi Brooks manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman into altering her estate plans. What this court has actually found is a family that systematically withdrew hundreds of thousands of dollars from that same woman under false pretenses, misrepresented loans as gifts and gifts as loans depending on what suited them in a given moment, and concealed for decades a biological connection that would have fundamentally changed how this family treated the defendant. I find no credible evidence of undue influence. I find substantial, well-documented evidence of financial exploitation committed by the plaintiffs themselves. She continued, her voice firm, now final. The petition to invalidate the Whitmore Legacy Trust is dismissed, with prejudice. The trust as written by Margaret Whitmore shall stand in full, distributed entirely to Naomi Brooks as specified. Furthermore, this court orders the plaintiffs to cover the defendant's full legal fees associated with this litigation. And given the financial records entered into evidence during this trial, I am formally referring this matter to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office for investigation into potential elder financial abuse, fraud, and concealment of inheritance-relevant information. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down once, sharp and final, and the sound seemed to echo longer than it should have. Naomi did not smile, she did not look triumphant. She simply exhaled slowly, the way she had been taught to breathe through every difficult moment of her life, and gathered the folder in front of her with the same steady hands she had carried into that courtroom on the very first day. Priya squeezed her shoulder once quietly and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Outside the courthouse, reporters who had caught wind of the case waited on the steps, but Naomi did not stop to speak to them. She walked past cameras and microphones the same way she had walked past 30 years of people who underestimated her, calm, unhurried, unwilling to perform for an audience that had never truly seen her until she made them look. That evening, alone in her apartment, Naomi opened the full letter Margaret had written, the parts that had not been read into the court record, the private words meant only for her. Margaret had written about the little girl on the staircase at midnight, about chess lessons and crossword puzzles and 30 years of Sunday visits that meant more to an old woman than her own children ever understood. She had written in her final line, "You spent your whole life being told you didn't belong. I hope, wherever you are when you read this, you finally understand that you belonged more than any of them ever did because you gave without asking for anything back. That was never weakness, Naomi, that was the deepest kind of strength there is." Naomi folded the letter carefully and placed it in the wooden box where she kept the only photograph she owned of the two of them together, taken at her college graduation, the day the rest of the family didn't bother to show up. She thought about the years of being called an outsider, the years of being tolerated instead of loved, the years of proving herself over and over to people who had already decided who she was before she ever opened her mouth. And she thought about the quiet, patient preparation that had carried her through every single one of those years, the discipline Margaret had planted in her long before anyone knew it would one day save her. The lawsuit that was meant to strip her of everything had instead revealed everything, the family's greed, their decades of quiet theft, and the truth about where Naomi had truly come from all along. She had not raised her voice once during the entire trial. She had not needed to. Sometimes the loudest victory comes from the person who simply refuses to be shaken, who prepares in silence while everyone else assumes silence means weakness, and who, when the moment finally arrives, needs only 2 words to change everything. What would you have done if the only family you ever knew turned around and accused you of stealing what was rightfully yours? Would you have fought back the way Naomi did, quietly, patiently, with evidence instead of anger? Or would the anger have won first? Tell us in the comments what you would have done in Naomi's place. And if this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more true-style courtroom revenge stories, because sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones holding all the power.